Okay, good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining this panel today. As Kate kindly said, my name is Irina Velkova. I work in our Grant Thornton's financial services regulatory practice, so I tend to advise clients on all sorts of regulatory matters. And I have the pleasure of moderating the discussions today. So first of all, I'd like our panelists to introduce themselves. I'll start with Kate, although I'm sure you've been here all day, so just quickly, probably.
Yeah, thank you so much. So again, I represent Ukrainian regulatory body. It's National Bank of Ukraine, and I was in also FinTech Strategy 2025 and the concept of regulatory platform. So right now I'm responsible for regulatory sandbox development and launch in Ukraine. So it's the first ever innovation hub, and I'm mostly focused on finance and FinTech.
Hi, I'm Ronan. I'm a Strategy and Innovation Manager at NatWest, but in the past year I've also been working on developing an understanding of fairness as it might relate to use of AI and advanced analytic technologies, and in the past I've been doing research into sort of the safety and inequality impacts of potentially wide-scale adoption of AI and advanced analytics technologies.
And I'm Bojana Bellamy. I'm president of Center for Information Policy Leadership. We are a global data privacy and data policy think tank. We work with global organizations, about 85 companies that support our work, and then regulators, policymakers, and lawmakers around the world on all things data and policy.
Thank you all for introducing yourselves. So, well, clearly in the last few years we have seen an increased use of artificial intelligence by companies in various products, services, in decision making as well, of course, and particularly how algorithms have been used in that. And of course, there has been quite a lot of debate around the ethics of the use of all those algorithms, but actually increasingly so about regulating properly AI, and given particularly the new regulations that come from the EU and the AI Act, and of course a number of papers issued by a number of governments, that seems to be very topical today, certainly almost a new shift. So perhaps to just start the conversation as in a little bit of context and background, what do you think are the risks of deploying AI without, if you like, proper regulations in place? And I think I'll start with Kay first.
Yeah, maybe. So I'm not a data scientist at all. So I'm, like I said, I am the representative of a regulatory body. And so just recently in December, we had the case, which maybe showcasing what does it mean to arrange any RegTech solutions without any regulation like it is in Ukraine. And so I have like very good friends of mine, and so it's the company, RegTech company startup. And they just created some solution, kind of a compliance solution for non-banking institutions. It's just new coming regulations, so not adjusted at the moment, but so it's already designed by this startup. They created that and applied to our innovation sandbox, which is right now on soft launch, just with the question, so guys, could you provide us with any like piece of advice? Is it okay for you or not? We are ready to help you with this compliance and etc., but we don't understand the future rules for the market. So maybe you will launch a bit later something different to our idea. Could you just advise us, is it okay or not? So when you don't have any clear conditions, not clear rules at all, so it's quite difficult for innovative solutions to come to the market. So it's from my side.
No, thank you. That's actually very insightful, because it sounds actually regulations are definitely going to help in that regard and in boosting innovation. And from your practical experience, Ronan, where you come on that, I mean, what do you perceive to be the risks?
So for me, the risks sort of come in 3 or 4 areas, but largely under the scope of unintended consequences. So unintended consequences to customers and individuals within society more broadly, if we are to exacerbate or double down on biases that, if regulation doesn't require business to understand the decisions that it makes and increasingly hands over to AI-based technologies. Similarly, there are risks relating to competition, because without strong regulation, there's the potential that actually irresponsible use of AI could be rewarded on the stock market for a number of years before incidents occur. There is that risk of real embedding in terms of the next generation of AI and data-led technologies being built on the data generated from poor or irresponsible AI, if not well regulated, having further knock-on unintended consequences. And then lastly, that position around just the direction we want to drive our society from our use of AI as a real expansionary technology, that piece on liability that is absent without strong regulation means some of the potentially more responsible use cases or more responsible users might be more reticent to take that technology on and do good with it if they're not sure how they're likely to be allowed to use it in the long run if they make that investment up front.
Yeah, no, sounds absolutely a very reasonable risk indeed. And Bojana, I can imagine that from your policy, with your policy hat, but also from your kind of data knowledge and perspective, you probably have a view on that as well.
Well, I mean, there's very little I can add here, but I certainly, the impact on people and their autonomy, integrity, human rights has to be relevant risk here. And that's why we talk, I work a lot in data privacy, and GDPR, this is data protection rules. They talk about sort of decisions that significantly impact people or create legal effects in people. So, you know, will I get a mortgage or not? Will I get a job or not? Will I be promoted or not? Will I be sentenced to jail, or will I be sentenced to less of a jail? Will I be allowed to enter the country or not? Will I be granted asylum? These are important decisions that are going to be made increasingly by AI and are being made. In fact, we hear that about 60% of decisions in the UK council level on benefits are made by help of AI. And there's nothing wrong with that. The question is, are they done properly, responsibly? Has there been human oversight in that? So that's why we are a bit reticent when we talk about AI development, we as people. And I think the main risk is that people will not trust the technology. They will say, I actually do not want a decision to be made by computer. I want a person. But let me be provocative. Does a person make a better decision? I don't know. You know, you all have been making hiring decisions. We normally hire people we like, who are similar to us. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's better, right? Because we need to work with these people. But objectively, maybe that person isn't the best for the job. So, and you know that story of Israeli judge, the research, right, which shows that judges give higher and harsher sentences just before lunch or after lunch. I can't exactly remember, just because that's how sort of human circadian clock works. And that shows you that, in fact, people are also biased. So we can't, if we're going to be using AI to improve people, it has to be better than that, right? And I think at the moment we are not quite sure that's the case. So there's a lot of distrust. So the big risk is distrust.
Yeah, no, and it's, to your earlier point, it's the question of making sure that wherever we deploy AI and how we use it, we do have the human oversight, and we make sure that the right ethics are in place as well, which is the big question around that. Well, if we flip and the question in a way, and the other side, okay, what do you think are areas that would certainly benefit from deploying even more AI if we had the right regulation in place? And maybe, Bojana, this time starting with you.
Yeah. I mean, I think health would be one area where there is lots of promise in proper use of AI. Diagnostic rates, prevention rates. I mean, we've seen that even with COVID, right? I wish there was more of AI and more generally sharing of data. I think security, information security, fraud prevention, cybersecurity. Sorry, Kate, I'm sure everybody has been talking about this, but we live in, you know.
I will add about FinTech.
Yes, I know, and I'm very sorry about this, that what you all going through and we all going through. And look, you know, there is a cyber war as well as people losing lives. And, you know, in this time, you know, you have to double down on your cyber defenses, and you have to be able to use information and use AI and protect and detect and do what you need to do. So I kind of feel there are lots of benefits. I think governments can do better delivery of government services through better use of AI. I mean, maybe even in hiring. I mean, look, we were talking about this. I used to work for a company where, you know, we would receive 100,000 applications for graduate programs globally. And you can't have anybody look at this physically. You have to put this through a computer system to say, we're looking only for top graduates, first, second, these things, this, you know, so at least some of these decisions have to be made by first tranche of a computer system. So I think there are lots of benefits. So my point is this. Risks are large, and they exist, but I think benefits are also large. And I think the smart regulation and the regulator will have to, and us who are deploying AI, will have to all the time weigh this. How do you weigh risks? We heard that from the previous speaker, but how do you weigh benefits? And how do you weigh the loss of opportunity if we do not deploy AI, if we do not do this? What's going to be the loss to the society, to people, and so on? And that's going to be a tricky one.
Yeah, and I still go back to my previous point. I think applying it ethically is probably the key here, and agreeing upfront which are the areas where indeed we can benefit, but also we apply it in a safe mode is perhaps the toughest question to answer. And to your point about the graduates, for example, funnily enough, I was talking at another event last night where social mobility was a big thing. Yeah. And AI is probably the worst kind of approach when we talk about social mobility, because you have to implement some sort of upfront criteria in order to do this kind of screening for thousands of applicants indeed. But then in this way, you exactly have the risk of hitting on the social mobility challenges, which is that you exclude some perhaps absolutely brilliant candidates simply because the algorithm doesn't recognize that. So it is that kind of upfront thinking, I think, that we all need to put into play. And from your perspective, Kate, obviously from the National Bank of Ukraine, how do you see the areas that AI will be most useful?
So we consider definitely 3 key areas for us. It's insurtech. Oh, sorry. It's insurtech, so the most important for us from financial markets view. Insurtech, so it can be underwriting, claim management, telematics, for example. Wealth management, it's mutual funds and saving plans, automated solutions. And FinTech, scoring credit systems, risk management, AML, something like that. And so like bright case for AI FinTech solution at FITZI, risk management and AML platform. It was mentioned previously by speakers over here. So our future vision.
Oh, I know FITZI. Yeah, they're fantastic. I'll tell you a story about FITZI. Okay, next question.
Cool.
And Ronan, obviously you as a bank, I'm sure you have lots of areas where you can benefit as well. Where do you see the biggest application?
I mean, for me, the criteria for a good application of AI at a broad level is that you need to have good and nearly universally good quality data. So looking at, as you mentioned, medical AI and diagnosis, you're looking at something like radiology and reviewing sort of x-rays. Actually, AI turns out is fantastic for that because universally high quality data, good quality inputs, and it solves a problem efficiently. It frees up the time of human radiologists that are stretched to do things that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to have the time to do. On the flip side, for general practice consultations, we've seen case studies from the US that actually that doesn't work so well because depending on your ethnic background, your gender, your socioeconomic background, your access to your access to good quality medical insurance, your general practice medical histories and those for your group will not be of either necessarily high quality or the same quality as other groups. So what comes out of that process in that application for diagnosis is not anywhere near as good, and there have been various studies kind of confirming that that's how that plays out. So for me, looking into finance, obviously the thing that everyone is particularly interested in is lending, in terms of, lending is already done based on score sheets. Those score sheets are informed by data science, but ultimately drawn up by humans. Do we think that the data that we have across society as a whole is of universally high and understandable quality, such that actually we would want to remove some of that human in the loop from it? Or are we simply going to use AI and that kind of intelligent analytics to better inform the data science component of it, but still ultimately have a human draw up that final scorecard because that's still necessary? That's something that I think no bank has really made a hard decision on. That's not something that I'm particularly involved with day to day. I think there are a lot of questions that we need to answer at a more foundational level in terms of that data quality, that what is fair, what is safe, how do you apply business ethics to AI before you start using it to make those complex financial decisions. But yeah, in summary, I think it is those things where right now, where we have that universally high quality data, that is the ripe space for really good and useful applications of AI. And
regulation is going to help with that, certainly, at least set a direction. of travel. So if we get into the meat of the discussion, if you like, if we were to regulate with a kind of common approach AI, where do we start? How do we approach it? And maybe Ronan, you start first this time.
So how do you approach it? I mean, you've got to apply an opportunity lens to it, because if you over-regulate, particularly at a national level or an industry level, you disadvantage yourself in terms of competition. And one of the key external risks to be aware of is AI developed in a different cultural and data context can't necessarily be translated to your own one as easily as a piece of standard software. So that has to be taken into account. But ultimately, I think we have a good model for it in the UK, in that every industry is regulated by a competent authority. So for banking, you have the FCA and the Prudential Regulatory Authority, and split between the two of them. And when in the past we've had things like EU directives to the UK, those are then rewritten up and implemented by that competent authority. So there's a question of, for finance specifically, is it that the competent authority simply needs more experienced help to understand how to apply their regulatory direction to AI? And then the second question being, are there some additional things with AI that cut across all industries, or are just entirely new and separate, that need a new way of regulating? And I think that means that there are almost two separate answers to that question. What do we need to do to better handle AI within our existing regulatory framework? And I think in the UK, we already have a good plan for that, in terms of setting up that Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation that will be able to provide regulators with that support. But the questions that we still need to answer are for the more AI-specific risks that go potentially broader than our current data regulation, and also then into things like international competition and bits like that.
Yeah, and you make an interesting point there, and there is a debate around that already, whether we need actually a separate authority in terms of regulating AI, whether we fit it within the existing framework, but that's perhaps further down the line. And Kate, from your perspective, how, obviously you represent kind of a body in a way, so how would you approach it?
I absolutely agree with overregulation, and it may kill like innovations, and this discussion was previously here. We had a presentation from the Netherlands Bank, and so what is the right point to regulate, not to be too early and too late? And so I just asked this question, what is the right moment to regulate? And the answer was, maybe if it appears something like Cambridge Analytica on your market, so maybe it's the right moment to regulate. And so how we started in Ukraine, so it was 2019, and we started from like expert body responsible for AI under support of Ministry of Digital Transformation. It's not at all financial regulator for Ukrainian markets, it's digital regulator. And then, so at the beginning, this committee included like 25 experts inside, and at the moment it's 45, and they just allowed to draft and to adjust the concept of AI development in Ukraine on 2021. So right now we have like the vision for the market. So it's how we started.
Yeah. And kind of implementing into principles and working
Yeah,
approaches.
it's like the key principles and like the key vision for that till 2030.
Yeah. And Bojana, from your point of view, where would you start with your policy?
I mean, this is exactly what I do every day in my life. So, and so every country in the world is now considering this question, to regulate or not to regulate. This is the question. And of course, EU has jumped, as they always do. We do, I suppose. And there is, of course, proposal for the proper EU AI regulation, which we can talk separately. I think that, but it's everywhere, from Japan to OECD to Brazil, US, of course, in the UK as well. We are now, I actually had a call yesterday with government on the financial impact of the AI regulation, and what would that look like if we had this or that. So they're thinking about this already. So I would say, to your point, Ronan, if something is already regulated, don't over-regulate, don't double-regulate. So we have a GDPR, which regulates use of personal data. So I would say where personal data is used in algorithm modeling, in AI, machine learning, we don't need to regulate that again. That's already regulated. So the question is then, what else isn't regulated? You talked about liability. Do we have tools to apportion liability between deployers of AI versus developers of AI? And it is tricky. I mean, potentially we might. What about other data, non-personal data? Other areas where there are risks? If we do regulate AI, I think what we need to make sure is that we do it light touch. Principle-based, you said that, Kate. Outcomes-based, you don't tell exactly to engineers how to do it, you say what the outcome should be. And you incentivize and encourage companies to actually build top-up, ethical, responsible AI practices. And I'm seeing a lot of that taking place at the moment. And it's coming from data scientists, but it's coming also from C-suite. Julie Sweet from Accenture just wrote an interesting blog saying, what should C-suite do now in terms of AI regulation? And she kind of says they have to own it. They have to understand it. You all here in financial sector, we had 2008 crisis where people simply, the leaders did not understand what the traders and clever coders and scientists were actually cooking in terms of financial instruments. And that's why we had the crisis. And this could be a similar moment where simply tech is going so fast that leadership cannot focus on this. We don't understand it. So we really need to think accountability, policies, procedures, controls, oversight, governance, ethics committees, all the things we talked about. So I would say a bit of regulation, light touch, but then encouraging, incentivizing, and then having a smart regulator. So I very much support, and we wrote a lot about regulatory sandboxes. We actually took the idea from the financial industry, moved it to data privacy and digital, and now really pushing it globally. And I'm glad to see that they're learning from you guys, but it's very slow. You've got 10 cases of regulatory sandbox in Norway on AI or UK. It's not good enough. We need to scale this. So how do we scale this for thousands and thousands of small FIDZ companies? Actually, they're not small. They're unicorn. They're great. But how do you do that at scale? But we need a smart regulator as well. I think they're a very important part of this puzzle.
Well, it's going to be a learning curve for the regulators themselves as well, because
huge.
obviously they have to be very flexible. And then to your point, certainly the top-down approach seems to be the best, and starting with the governance, and we're going to talk about accountability and liability in a minute, but I think that from what we can see in our experience in Thornton as well, this is where the biggest failures happen. It's in every single thing that comes into business. It's all about governance and accountability at the end of the day, and this is where the big holes are. So perhaps this is the way to think about it. But you mentioned something really interesting at the start, Ronan, and it probably owns a separate question, which is along the lines of, if we are to regulate it, do we start locally or globally? Where do we start? And maybe Kate, first you. What was your kind of approach on that?
Yeah, maybe. So we started locally at first, right? So created those body. But in my previously designed FinTech strategy, it was like the most strategic document at the moment for financial markets. So we put the key principle to be like open ecosystem and to create ecosystem itself. And so why we had in global right now, because we have this vision. And so after creating this body on AI development, so we signed those OECD principles, and right now we became a member of ad hoc committee on AI as well. So it's the points we are staying at the moment. So I don't know what will be further, but so it's interconnection definitely of local and global.
Yeah. And from a banking point of view, Ronan, actually, I think that's very critical, particularly for some of the large international banks. How would you think about it?
So I think it actually comes down to probably the same answer for both whether or not you regulate across AI as a whole, across different industries, and whether or not you try to regulate between countries. Because it is that change in approach to regulation that's not necessarily being brought by AI itself, but by the increasingly data-driven decision-making that we see, and that bringing in of wider data that, a bank in 2025 might want to use data that you would have never seen in the banking industry, but you would have seen in a different regulated industry 15 years ago. So at that point, you think, actually, maybe we need something going across the top, because what a regulated bank produces in data might be consumed by another industry that's not under banking regulation and used to make another decision. Similarly, at an international level, of course, you again need to regulate locally first, because that is what you as a nation will be competent for. You understand your own systems of rights and those frameworks. But I think international cooperation is really key from the start, again, because that as data becomes more internationalized, as the global platforms like you've got Google, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, those are increasingly integrated with everything else we do, from finance and lending through to identity management. Actually, you probably do want global cooperation on how that data is being used, and as well as algorithmically to do that. But I think it does come also back to something that Bojana mentioned on the previous question around, we already have a GDPR for Europe that does actually have sections that cover automated decision making. They're not talked about that much, they're not tested in court that often, but they do exist, they are there. And there's an element of, what do we actually need additional to that? Or is it simply a case of better understanding and enforcing and making it better understood by both other regulators and the corporations developing this technology, what the existing landscape for AI regulation is if they cross certain thresholds?
You have all spoken about the risk of overregulation, and clearly that is a concern in that field. So I guess if you think about how potentially overregulation could circumvent innovation, where do you see the risks? And maybe Bojana, starting with you.
Well, I mean, GDPR is a great example. I mean, nobody dares say that, but there's been less research in Europe, less sharing. We couldn't share data for COVID purposes between Europe and US, because there's this reticence risk. People are so scared of violating GDPR that they say no. And that's terrible. I mean, that could be they're mistaken, there's misinformation in the market, there is, people don't understand it, or simply the law doesn't work very well by design. So both things, I think that is a big learning moment as to how this could work better. And you can see the UK government is actually trying to reform its data protection, general data regime, and thinking, we still want protection, privacy, and AI protections, of course, use of data for AI, but we need to take away the burden, get rid of red tape, think about the spirit, risk-based accountability. That's really what matters in the law. So, so I'll tell you the FinTech story, if I may. There was a great project in Europe that actually was started by Facebook, Meta, pioneering so-called policy prototyping. Okay, this is something interesting that I think we talked to a lot of regulators. So if you are, and we kind of took an example of risk assessment in AI. If we were to require companies to do risk assessment, AI impact assessment, the way it's been required, what does that look like? And they've taken 10 big unicorns and some smaller startups. Desire was one of them, to do some this impact assessment. There was some help there in guidance and so on. And actually, Pedro and the team have done this. And I chaired one of the sessions for regulators. And what was really interesting, and they said, actually, it helped us. It helped us do this privacy impact assessment and AI impact assessment, because it forced us to think about these things earlier in the life cycle of the development of a product and service, and therefore our product was better placed. There were no hiccups later on. We could sell it. We could ask the clients could answer. We could answer the questions better. So in fact, it showed that if you have got smart regulation, not too much, but with some guidance, actually SMEs and these startups could actually work with it. But with of course the guidance that was coming at that point, it was part of that massive project. So this whole policy prototype is called Open Loop. If anybody wants to look at it, and I know Facebook is doing quite a lot on that globally. But this is a very interesting example, which shows you that you can do the right thing with the right regulation, but even without the regulation, these startups will be doing impact assessment because it actually made sense for their business. And that's how we have to think. Use the motivation that companies have got to do the right thing as opposed to put something on top. That's my view.
Yeah, it's just making sure that you consider the risks at the front, because
Exactly.
That's absolutely critical in order to safely deploy whatever technology innovation you have in place. And from your experience, Kate, obviously with the Bank of Ukraine, how you've seen the innovation working together with regulation?
You know, I would like to add to this statement, previous one, and Fidza and others. So when we just started to learn how to develop and how to design a regulator sandbox, so I just made a research like over 20 plus fintech ecosystem altogether, and what are the criteria for them, and etc. etc. And so we just had a question for us, basic question, how to design. So to put inside any technological platform to allow to test innovations on the basis of it or not. And so we just answered the question that we cannot be ahead of the market. Because the innovators are always like ahead of the regulator. So we are just following the strategy like market-driven regulator. We listen to our marketplace and trying to be in touch, to discuss something. We are open. Right now we are creating the rule book for our regulator sandbox. It's always like public process. So doing any rule books, we are heading to the market, discussing and arranging some strategic workshops or something and get feedback. And then we just correlate our vision and then launch and adjust and etc. etc. And so I suppose this approach is very nice and we will follow it.
You mean it's almost like innovation is already incorporated in the regulation because it's such a joint process?
And those cooperation, you know, in between regulator and marketplace.
And Ronan, how do you say the interaction between innovation and regulation?
So I think for me, I see it as if you over-regulate, then of course regulations only apply to a specific set of companies and specific industries. Therefore, over-regulating in one way more allows those who are outside of the regulation to innovate differently and then disrupt that industry. But not everything that is invented or innovated or disruptive is good. And I think that actually ties back to a different angle on what Bojana was saying on the GDPR. I mean, the GDPR is an example of, when we've been talking about, you know, how you want to go a high-level, light-touch, principle-based. GDPR was relatively heavy touch, but it was very, very principle-based. And a lot of the confusion that comes from its principle basis is a lack of alignment, I think, particularly in terms of understandings and interpretations of privacy law in the UK and the EU with what is actually within GDPR. And because some of that stuff's not clarified and it's implemented differently, people aren't, particularly privacy lawyers, aren't willing to provide an opinion that joins some of those dots together. However, what we've seen is an evolution almost in how regulation is delivered, because both in terms of GDPR and the first Payment Services Directive, we saw just poor implementation across the board. We saw companies that were subject to those kind of trying to do as little as possible to implement them and really not taking very divergent paths, which meant a lot of the value that was intended by doing the lighter touch principle-based regulation wasn't delivered. I think in terms of GDPR, there was very much a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. And almost without fail, everybody chose the wrong way because it was cheaper and easier at the time. What we saw with the second Payment Services Directive was it came with a regulatory technical standard, which said, actually, here are some things that, you know, we don't want to tell you how to do your job, but these are some things that you will need to do the same way if we want to make this work. I think GDPR really needed one of those when it was first penned. And we would see a very different landscape for it and a lot more opportunity from it today, because that is how you as a regulator can go, okay, I want to enable innovation, but that innovation has to be fair and it has to be equal. These are the things that you need to do the same way. This is why you've got to do them that way. And you know, it's not perfect with PSD2, but it's a step in the right direction to facilitate that innovation, but make it clear what is and isn't possible, make those opinions easier to form, because that technical you understand actually at a technical delivery level, this is what that piece of regulation actually is trying to get out of it. And I think with AI, I mean, AI is such a broad topic. It's far broader than, I mean, I'd say AI is actually broader than data protection in the long run. You're probably not going to have one unified AI regulation that could have a unified technical standard in the way payment services can for those specific areas. But in order to permit innovation and also ensure that that innovation is in a positive direction for society, for the economy, for your country and the countries around you, that is where that collaboration internationally on technical standards and saying, this is what we want, this is also what we really would rather not have. That's how you enable that innovation, because otherwise there's the disruption risk that comes, and it's almost, you want the disruption to come from something that sits within the scope of regulation. Disruption and innovative disruption that comes from the purposes of evading regulation is probably less favourable from a regulator's perspective and an incumbent's perspective than disruption that is actually, no, the incumbents have done that wrong, we're going to show you how to do it better. And yeah, I think long story short, I'm not going to do a long story short, I'm just going to cut myself off there.
Yeah, no, it's a learning process for everybody, including the regulators, and it is going to take time that we all get to this kind of technical detail that is really going to help the innovation part as well. The one part we can't afford to fail, though, is the bit around accountability and liability, and it's been in the public space for a long time. It's still an ongoing debate. So in your view, where do you think liability and accountability should sit within an organization? I mean, obviously we can make the bots liable, but who do you make accountable then? And maybe Ronan, you first.
So for me, this is actually a relatively straightforward answer, and I think that's because banking is one of the few industries for which this is already a thing for a number of other reasons. We have a set of people at the top of the bank who are liable for mistakes that the bank makes. They are people that the regulator is involved with their appointment and chooses whether or not they can still serve those roles, etc. The challenge, I think, for us is more around the liability from a supplier side, as every single bit of technology you buy in and technology that you've already bought in that you're now just updating to the latest version and software will start to use AI. It will have its own data supply processes. For us, I think for a bank, the question is probably more, where does the liability sit in terms of that and in terms of the developer of a third-party AI product that you then use versus where does the liability sit if a bank used AI to make an incorrect lending decision, because actually there's no change there. The banks are liable for incorrect lending decisions for X, Y, and Z, we know that. And what I'd say is, what's interesting is you then get to the piece of, for third-party software AI software developers, do they understand and do they make really clear what the acceptable use cases are and are not? Yeah. The BBC released a documentary last night on AI hiring, and one of the case studies was around an piece of AI hiring software that was meant to be used for actual hiring, but one of the companies that used it actually used it to manage a redundancy process to decide who would get made redundant. Now, the company that developed that software said that they weren't aware of that being a use case for their software. That's not what they'd really built it for. So I think that the scenario that came out of that probably is something that GDPR covers, but who would be liable at the end of the day there? Is it the company that developed the software that caused something that was probably a GDPR violation? Was it the company implementing that piece of software in a way that wasn't intended by the developer? That we don't know yet. And I mean, ultimately, we have a good enough existing legal framework to hash these things out in court that will then inform that future regulation in a few years' time as it's built. And I think that's where that will come from.
Yeah. And other applications of similar regulations which kind of would make a precedent. And Bojana, from your point of view?
I mean, this is a very interesting example because you kind of ask yourself, they're manufacturers of scissors, but the manufacturer of scissors is not liable when somebody takes scissors and kills somebody. Yeah. So it's very tricky here. In your example, and we've seen some of the software AI developers create sort of model cards and provide transparency, explainability to ensure that you comply, you who are using their tools. But ultimately, you can't blame the software developer for everything. But on accountability, I really think this is going to be critical. And what I mean by accountability is actually having a program in place. CIPL has been working a lot on this in terms of privacy program management and what that looks like in digital world. And I think the same is going to be for the AI. You have to have a program in place from leadership and oversight, governance to risk assessments, policies, tools, controls, training, audits, and then what happens when something goes wrong? When do you complain? And so companies will have to put this in place, and it will have to be owned absolutely at the top. Yeah. I reckon that we will have a board level representation of AI in terms of AI accountability, responsibility. We are seeing a number of companies now adopt and put in place ethics or digital or data ethics committees. Some are even appointing external boards to help them navigate these ethical difficult decisions. But it's everybody's job, from data scientists, those who are developing technologies, to lawyers who are working on this. We need people with translator skills, this kind of multi-technology law policy skills to make it really work in the company. Yeah. And then we'll have to be able to demonstrate. Maybe there'll be certifications, maybe there'll be codes of conduct, but companies will have to demonstrate this. Maybe in 10 years we'll have to write in our annual reports how we manage our AI or development of new technologies.
Or your black box.
Your black box, yeah.
I was just going to add that it's another one of those areas that makes a lot more straightforward sense from a bank perspective, in that following the financial crisis and the PPI scandal, we have the concept of mis-selling in financial products, that you need to make sure that the person buying your product understands how it is to be used, what's the right way and the wrong way to use it, are they the right people to have it? Do we need to actually look at mis-selling or appropriate selling for consequential AI applications, saying, okay, you want to buy my hiring tool, well, this is what it can be used for and we're confident it works for. This is, and if you use it outside of those bounds, then you might be taking on some more of that liability.
Yeah. No, thank you, and thank you very much for all your responses. I'm told we need to finish in time, so I'm going to draw a conclusion of our conversation, but I'm going to open the floor for a few questions if we had any, just for the last 5 minutes of the session we have. No questions?
I know, but it was great.
Okay, excellent.
Cool conversation. I didn't know what to expect, but that was awesome.
Yeah,
thank you.
Well, thank you very much for being here in person today, indeed. And again, thank you very much for your insight. Absolutely fascinating topic, and certainly we will have a lot more to debate on that. And we're probably going to find ourselves next year here again talking about it, but let's see.
And nothing has changed.
Thank you.
Irina,
Thank you.